Okay, this is from the book The Medical Reformation by me, Pete Rogers, and it's also called the subtitle sort of Vegan Renaissance, Poor Man's Guide to Health, Nutrition, and Toxicology. And we ended on this page. This is part 8 of What is Cancer. So for any disease, you want to know what causes it, because when you know what causes it, usually by avoiding the cause, that ends up being a very good treatment as well. And some of the points I'm making here, and not to brag, but what I'm really giving you, if you're sensitive enough to get it, is a comprehensive, unified theory of much of pathophysiology. So what I showed you here, after we had gone over atherosclerosis, what I showed you was the same thing that damages the arterial wall and causes a blood clot to form on the arterial wall, which is atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a blood clot. Also weakens the arterial wall in a sense. It normally has an antithrombotic glycocalyx that has a zeta potential, meaning a negative charge on it to repel blood cells, okay? And that negative charge prevents metastatic cancer from sticking to the wall of the artery. However, when you have hypertension, you're damaging the arterial wall. And also the high-fat diets that cause activation of the neutrophils to release something called myeloperoxidase, which is really cationic, very positively charged, and it will then interact with the zeta potential on the glycocalyx, the coating of the arterial wall, and cause it to collapse down. And then the arterial lining cells, the endothelium, will express these little brown dots here, which are to represent prothrombotic molecules. You see, normally the green cells, the glycocalyx, is antithrombotic, has a negative charge, a zeta potential. But the antithrombotic glycocalyx, EG is for endothelial glycocalyx, is shed in the context of hypertension, in the context of eating a high-fat meal. And then metastatic cells are more able to bind to these adhesive molecules that are located down deep in the grass, so to speak. And that increases the risk of metastatic disease. So these are the things I'm showing you, and they're pretty interesting. So basically what I say, the same thing that causes hypertension and insulin resistance, these high-fat meals also cause increased metastatic cancer spread. They also cause tissue hypoxia, increasing your risk of causing cancer. They also, the high-fat, in particular sat fat, inhibits mitochondrial electron transport. Inhibition of mitochondrial electron transport can damage the mitochondria. Of course, it causes insulin resistance, major disease, but also a damaged mitochondria is the mechanism of the Warburg effect for inducing cancer to start in the first place. And then in my separate lectures, I talked about how it's now becoming clear that damage to mitochondria is one of the main problems with aging that is strongly associated with immune system dysfunction and immune system, in a sense, suppression, which increases cancer risk. So do you see where this is going? There's like a unified pattern of disease that comes at people. And the same problem, the high dietary fat, the high dietary sodium, causes numerous downstream problems. And the good news in all that, though, is if you just avoid the stuff that causes the problems, you'll have a lot less problems. You don't have to be a genius to avoid high-fat foods and to avoid high dietary sodium. Okay, there's more to it, of course. You want to avoid all the mitochondrial toxins. I talked about that in a separate video, avoiding mitochondrial toxins. But you can see how they don't just cause brain damage, make you stupid. They also increase your risk of cancer. They also increase your risk of diabetes. You make yourself fat, sick, and stupid. And I can tell you, most Americans over 60 are fat, sick, and stupid. And it doesn't have to be that way. For some reason, the default setting of most people's personality is always to do everything half-assed. Well, I'm cutting down on meat a little bit. I'm cutting down on oil a little bit. And it's like, don't be an idiot. Just stop eating animal foods, stop eating oil if you want to optimize your health. Why wouldn't you want to optimize your health? Okay, so anyways, this is a rather profound thing. This is an AO, an academic orgasm. And so, and here's one of the papers if you want. Flow-related endothelial glycocalyx determines metastatic cancer activity. Okay, there's the paper if you want it. Okay. And so I'm real happy to learn these things now. But on the other hand, I'm a little pissed off because, I always wanted to be a great doctor. I might have been able to save my mother's life if I had known this. So I wish I had known this. And it's kind of annoying that almost all of the useful information, it's not in the books, okay? Just to give you a sense of the books, here's one of my pathology books, okay? kind of, the Rubin and Farber book. It's a big book. There's the, Robbins, Cotran, and Kumar Harvard book. These are big honking books. What is the number of pages on it? This one is 1,300 pages. The other one's, about the same size. And they don't tell you the useful information. I know what's in those books. I was first in my class, 99 percentile, best of 333 students in my med school class in pathology and pretty much most other things. Okay, so why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because the books don't have the answers. The books stink. They hide the truth from you. Okay, conventional medicine has really been illegitimate in a lot of ways for a long time with regard to conventional disease. It's a disgrace, and it's only getting worse. It's not getting better. All this high-tech BS about AI, who do you think is going to write the program for AI? The drug company. And what are they going to say? Need to prescribe more drugs. It's a joke, okay? And that's why I say if you want to be smart, you have to first realize no one cares about you. Once you get that, then you could start thinking intelligently. Because I know a lot of people, and sometimes a pretty woman, like my wife, is a pretty woman, and she sort of thinks of what I would call a benign universe. Oh, everything's okay, the regulatory agencies and institutions are watching out for me. Yeah, right. I'll sell you a bridge, okay? So we're not going to go any farther with that line of thought right now, but I can just tell you it makes a big difference. That one little assumption. Things are designed to help the individual, the patient, the plebeian, the pro, or they're not. And once you say, well, they're not, they're just designed to make money and feed the goals of the big money, then you can start figuring all kinds of things out. Okay, here is adenosine triphosphate, ATP. That's the energy currency of a cell. It's like a $20 bill in a cell for getting work done. So there's 3 phosphates in a row. They all have a negative charge on them. So these negative charges want to repel each other. They want to pop apart. But the magnesium with its 2 positive charge grabs on and says, whoa, stay, like holding a bucking bronco in place. Okay, so that's why you need magnesium. Most people are deficient in magnesium. You need magnesium to effectively run these ATP reactions. You actually need magnesium to be able to adequately correct and maintain the normal amounts of potassium. All right. So that's a big thing to know. You need to know that. Magnesium stabilizes ATP and is necessary for ATP-related chemical reactions, which is tons of reactions, okay? And again, you're going to see that as a common theme. The good stuff is in the plants, all right? And then where do you find magnesium in plants? It's sitting right in the center of chlorophyll, okay? When somebody initially first, starts out with all their health problems, it might be wise to supplement with magnesium, but eventually eat the plants. That'll more rapidly get their magnesium up to par. And you take magnesium orally, you get diarrhea too if you take too much. So that's one useful thing. All right. So, here's a little quote. This is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Above all, love each other deeply, for love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to each other. Use whatever gift you have received to help others. And I would say, above all, for health, eat the low-fat vegan diet because it covers a multitude of dietary and lifestyle sins. Let's see where we're going to go with that. So that's a big thing. I already talked about love when I gave another video. I was talking about paintings in St. Paul, preaching to the Areopagus. Okay, why is vegan diet so good for your health? And by the way, I could care less about animal rights. If eating meat would make me 18 years old again, I would do it. Okay, I mean, I like people to be nice to animals, but what I'm trying to say is there's some vegans who are coming to you from an animal rights perspective. I'm not, okay? I'm coming at it from, I want open arteries. I want to stay healthy. The plant diet has fiber. Fiber comes from plants. You don't have any fiber in meat. You don't have very little in processed foods. Plant foods have way more potassium. P for plants, P for potassium. It's a vasodilator, keeps your arteries open. Fiber maintains your gut barrier to prevent leaky gut, to prevent abnormal intestinal permeability. The short-chain fatty acids, basically the fiber is converted by the good gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids, and they're used to maintain the tight junctions of the intestinal lining, the enterocytes, the epithelial barrier of the gut, but they're also used to maintain the blood-brain barrier. So they prevent you from getting brain fog. They make you smarter. Because I get students, I sometimes get college students, medical students sent to me, graduate students in other fields, and they're like, well, they'd like to do better in school. And I'll start talking to them, and I'll say, well, you need to eat a low-fat vegan diet. And they're like, why? And they also say to me, oh, some people are just smart. They start saying all this stupid stuff. And I tell them, look, just listen to what I say. Give it a try for a month or two. You will see the benefits, okay? You know, a little college student really shouldn't argue with somebody who's trying to help them and knows a lot more than they do. Okay, so the fiber maintains your blood-brain barrier so that you don't get all this crap after you eat, postprandial garbage and toxins getting across your blood-brain barrier, causing brain fog, making you stupid. Okay, you have a lot more potassium. We talked about that, vasodilator to open up your arteries. Everything works better with good blood flow. You have a lot more magnesium. It's a vasodilator. Together, these work to make the potassium-sodium plasma membrane, ATPase pumps work effectively. Then you can handle your calcium effectively. That makes you more intelligent. You get more antioxidants so you can prevent oxidative stress. You have a more alkaline meal, and that has other health benefits we're not going to get into right now, but it does. Okay, this now is the wall. Oops, this is the wall of, like I say, an artery here. Oh, I keep catching the wrong thing. And so this, by the way, is illustration 3558. For anybody following in the book, I'll give you the page number. The page number is 525. Okay, so here is the plasma membrane of an endothelial cell, EC, endothelial cell plasma membrane. And these are the proteins in there called proteoglycans. They're proteo for protein, glycan for the sugar component. And they got these things on there coming off of them called GAGs. These are glycosaminoglycans, repeating units of sugars, or like a disaccharide it's called. And it's called heparin sulfate. And because of all the sulfates, there's a big negative charge on here. And that's the zeta potential of the endothelial cell. You'll also have sialic acids at the ends of it, and those also have a negative charge on them. We've talked about those before. You will also have some cholesterol sulfates mixed in there, and that also produces a negative charge. Water can form a dipole, meaning that you'll have partial charges. The oxygen will have a partial negative charge on it. The hydrogens will have partial positive charges on them, and these positive charges will line up with the negative charge of the endothelial glycocalyx zeta potential. And the point of all this is, you've heard the expression slippery when wet. So this makes it very slippery. There's repulsion by the negative charges for the negatively charged red blood cells flowing through the vessel, and the WBCs, white blood cells, as well. And there's water on them making it slippery so they can slide through that capillary more effectively. So it's kind of cool. The closer you look at this stuff, the more awesome and brilliant and genius level it is. Okay. Okay, so what I'm trying to say, these zeta potentials aren't just on red blood cells. They run the whole vascular system. I talked about slippery when wet, like slippery jello is like the surface of the endothelium. It's glycocalyx. Okay, now here is the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And what you're doing is you're pumping in 2 potassiums, you're pumping out 3 sodiums. And then magnesium hangs on to the ATP till it's ready to release a phosphate. And then it goes from ATP, adenosine triphosphate, tri for 3 phosphates, to adenosine diphosphate, di for 2 phosphates. And people will often call this the sodium-potassium ATPase. I'll call it the potassium-sodium just because it reminds you of that potassium. I put the thing first that's coming into the cell, okay? It's just sort of a nomenclature standardization to make it easier to make sense of all this stuff. So because you're pumping out 3 positive charges, 3 sodiums, and only pumping in 2 positive charges, 2 potassiums, you have a net effect of pumping positive charge out of the cell. And you build up a negative gradient. That's an electrical gradient across the plasma membrane, about negative 65 millivolts. Okay? Now, you also build up a chemical gradient of more concentration of sodium outside the cell. It's about 10 to 1, 10 times more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. And now sodium really wants to enter the cell because it wants to approach the negative charge inside the cell and also to equalize its chemical gradient of 10 to 1. And that can be used coupled to pumping calcium out of the cell. This is the NACA exchanger, NACA. Na for sodium, Ca for calcium. It's often abbreviated NCX. So this was active transport, meaning using ATP to pump the sodiums out, and then letting the sodium come back in as a way to couple that like a spinning wheel here to pump calcium out of the cell. This is secondary active transport because the gradients produced were dependent on this ATP pump as primary active transport. Anyways, this NACA exchanger can pump out thousands of calciums per second. So it's very fast, and that's what you need in excitable cells like muscle cells, cardiac cells, and in neurons. Okay, so You know, life on Earth depends on this right here. It might seem a little mundane, but this is big stuff. The potassium-sodium pump, needing magnesium, needing ATP, being coupled to pumping calcium outside of a cell, okay? This keeps humans alive and healthy. You need to know that. I'm going to give you some examples of how it all works. And by the way, an average cell will use about 1/3 of its ATP energy to run that potassium-sodium ATP pump. A neuron will use like 1/2 to 2/3 of its energy to run that pump. So whenever the body uses most of its energy to do something, that means it's really, really, really important. It's basically like a battery. You know, the way the wall of the cell works, you have a separation of charge. Here's the charge separation gradient. You have current flowing in the form of these ions, and you have like a capacitor that separates the charge. That's like a battery. So the cells invented electricity a long, long time ago before humans could read and write. Okay? And to run normally, a person has to eat adequate amounts of potassium and very little sodium to run this thing optimally. We're designed to eat that diet, like that plant-based diet that's real high in potassium and low in sodium. If you want to read a book about all this stuff, this is the best book. This is one of the all-time best health books ever written. It's written by this guy, Richard Moore. He's an MD, PhD. He spent his whole life, his whole adult career life, researching plasma membrane pumps and sodium and potassium and calcium. Okay, it's an absolutely brilliant book. The guy's legacy, and those are a lot of times, in my experience, the best science books. When some guy writes a legacy book, he's kind of pissed off about being ignored his science most of his life. And so he says, I'm going to tell the public, whoever's smart enough to read it, so they can learn. And so it's called The High Blood Pressure Solution by Richard Moore, MD, PhD. It's a magnificent book. It's a masterpiece. He said that to prevent hypertension, people need to eat at least 5 times more potassium than sodium. I would say you want to go higher than that. I would probably, you know, if you just eat a plant-based diet, you'll end up with more than that. I think our answer is probably ate about 25 times more potassium than sodium. But my standards of what would be optimal blood pressure are a little more tighter than his. I'd like the pressure a little lower than what he thinks is good. So I'd probably want you eating more than that. But I don't count anything. You maybe count it once to figure out how it all works, and then just eat the plant foods. You'll get plenty of potassium. Okay, and we talked about magnesium being located in the center of chlorophyll. So eat the plant foods. You'll get your chlorophyll. You get all the good stuff. It's in the plants, the potassium, the magnesium. The nitrates, precursors for nitric oxide, the antioxidants, the fiber. Okay. People who've got severe kidney failure have to be a little more careful because they might have difficulty excreting the potassium and it could build up in their blood, so they'd have to be more careful. But a normal, healthy person, you know, can obviously eat a lot of plant foods and feel pretty good. So Richard Moore used this term, the K factor, and what he means by K factor is the ratio of potassium to sodium. And again, he says it should be at least 5 to 1. But I'm saying if you eat 100% vegan, you'll end up eating a lot more than that. I probably eat about 25 to 1 potassium to sodium. Our kidneys are designed to piss out extra potassium. They're actually kind of designed to conserve sodium. That's why it's hard to do things the other way around like modern Americans do. Here's a nice slide that Richard Moore made, concept that he taught me. Basically, the amount of potassium and sodium in the body is relatively constant. These are both, you know, monocations. They both have a single positive charge on them. So what the point of this is, when you eat lots of dietary sodium, your body will excrete potassium from the kidney, and you'll become progressively diminished and deficient in potassium. And the body keeps it constant. And I can tell you, one of my internal medicine doctor friends, really smart guy, he said when I saw all this, when he read all this stuff, he's like, holy crap. The human body is so much smarter than doctors. It's not even funny that the only intelligent thing to do is just give it the food that it's designed to have and let it handle everything else itself. You know, the idea that they can control things well with their pills, the closer you look at it, the more of a joke it is compared to just eating the food you're supposed to eat and letting the system do what it's supposed to do. As far as remembering these cations, you can remember, well, you don't really need this. I would remember a cat purrs, P for purrs, P for positive charge on cations. Anions have negative charge in terms of ions, so that's not so important unless you're taking it for school, but remember that they're held constant. And they have to hold them constant because otherwise you would have hyperosmolality problems and you'd get cell bursting from osmolality gradient stuff. You can think of potassium and sodium ions as minimum wage workers, and calcium's like the big aristocrat that comes in there, makes things happen, bosses everybody around. Okay, all right. So here's a more detailed slide to show what happens in a cell. You got the same potassium, sodium, ATP as pump, bringing 2 potassium in, 3 sodium out. The bottom line is you're pumping more positive charge out. So you establish a gradient inside the cell, negative 65 millivolts. And then it's also a chemical gradient because you got 10 to 1 sodium outside the cell compared to inside the cell. All right, you got like 14 sodium in per 140 outside the cell. So that means sodium really wants to come in for the electrical reasons to move towards a negative charge, and for its gradient reasons, concentration gradient reasons, to equalize its concentration on both sides of the plasma membrane. And this desire of sodium to come in can be coupled to pumping calcium out. The gradient for calcium is off the charts. It's incredible how high it is. It's like 10,000 to 15,000 to 1. That much more calcium outside the cell than inside the cell. And because the concentration of calcium is so high, so super high outside the cell, you have to have ATP involved in the gradient system for pumping it out. And what that's going to mean, we're going to come back to that subject later, but you have to have good mitochondrial function to make all this ATP, because you got to remember, this is half of the energy, 1/3 of the energy of most cells, but a half to 65%, so a half to 2/3 of the energy for a neuron. So that neuron mitochondria must be making tons of ATP to pump this calcium out of the cell. And if it doesn't, the calcium builds up, the cell becomes overactivated, and then it goes into apoptosis and dies. That's getting back to my neurovascular theory of neurovascular uncoupling causing neurodegeneration. That's a big concept because tons and tons of people are cognitively impaired. Lots of things are increasing calcium inside of neurons. All these stimulants, all this EMF. Okay, so that's how it works, and it's basically a battery gradient. I'll show you one more thing just about where the ions are at, but we're about to end it for today. Okay, so here's just, again, the concentration gradients. Potassium's much higher inside the cell, let's say about 150, 140 compared to what it is outside the cell. Calcium is 10,000 times to 15,000 times higher. This is in the blood and extracellular matrix, so it's much higher out here. So the calcium and the sodium are high in the extracellular matrix and the blood. The potassium is high inside the cell, but low in the other 2 areas. Okay. So we'll end right here for today, and we'll continue on with the next lecture. I hope that was helpful to you.